Hey, how's it going? This is Dylan with Dylan Talks Tone, and I just realized the other day that we've not actually done any proper soldering how-to stuff. So there's a lot of soldering stuff on the internet, but a lot of it doesn't apply directly to working on guitars. Okay, so we're going to talk specifically about soldering, what we use to solder on the guitar, and then also, so we've got a blade switch, we've got a pot, we've got a cap, and some wire that you typically use to work inside a guitar. So we're going to show you specifically with those materials a couple of tips and tricks that we like to use so that everything works perfect and you don't fight, your project. So I'm going to reset the camera and let's get right to it. If you can go back, there's an earlier video, I'll put a link to it in the description of this video, where we discuss the actual tools that we use to solder. So, but let's get right to this. So, first of all, let's take us a piece of solder here. And one of the things I want to talk about is, and the things that people kind of get mixed up is, this is not welding. We're not melting things together. Okay, so we're not trying to get these two things to bind together. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get the solder, to melt and bond with both sides of the project. The thing is that we need to get both sides of the project up to the correct heat so that it bonds to both sides equally. Okay, so it's a heat thing. It's not really, we're not melting anything, it's a bonding thing. So let's look first at a Telecaster switch. Now, how much heat do you typically use? I use 700 degrees. That's a little hot for some people. Some people think that that's a little bit too hot, but let me show you why I do. So the way we're going to do this, the way we're going to solder, is we're going to have our solder tip. We're not going to go straight on the end of it like this. We're going to kind of go on the side so that the heat transfers through it. Okay? And then we're going to touch it. And we're going to make sure that that kind of just bonds all the way closed. See that? Now, the reason that was so easy and the way I was able to do that is because I was able to put a correct amount of heat into the item. If the solder tip is not hot enough, then you will not be able to do that. The thing is that if you have to leave it on there for a long period of time, then heat will transfer through the rest of the component and possibly do damage to it. So that's why I like to use a lot more heat. Now, I'm going to show you something that kind of can happen to somebody. This happens, cold solders happen all the time, and I'm going to show you why they happen. So let's solder this wire into this control plate, okay? Alright, so now I'm going to solder this into this control plate, and see how I was able to break that free? The reason is because a lot of times people, when they're soldering a wire into a lug like this, number one, they don't use enough solder, possibly, and number two, they allow it to move too much. So what I would recommend is to, instead of solder it closed like this and then try to put the wire into it, because that will cause you to move the wire while it is binding, let's do it a different way. Let's put this in here and kind of bind it so it doesn't move. Okay, so we want to bind it so it doesn't move like that. Now, there's a trick here. We need to put the equivalent amount of heat into both sides of the project. The switch and the wire. I'm working around the camera, so I'm trying to see what I'm doing there. Let's see if we've got a good solder joint. We sure do. And there it is. And the reason this is a better joint is because we put the wire through, we bound it kind of against itself in there so that it wouldn't wiggle, and then we heated both components up to temperature at the same time instead of heating them separately. It makes for a stronger solder joint. Okay, same thing with a capacitor. Let's take a capacitor and let's create a tone circuit here. On typically, let's make a tone circuit. Let's take this pot and we will put this on here. Now see, this could be a problem because this is wiggling around. So what I like to do is bend that a little bit so that that sits nice and tight. Let's see, let's get it Let's kind of bind it in there a little bit. All right, so there we go. Now, we can set the soldering iron on there to heat both items at the same time. And there we are. And see, it just took a touch of both sides, okay? It just took a touch of both sides. Now you're able to go ahead and trim this piece off. Now, this is where it gets kind of tough for some people. Some people have a hard time soldering a lead to a pot. Now this is the same thing. We're having problems here because this is going to move around. So what we try to do is create a situation where this actually binds against it and pushes against it. Now, the way I usually do this, let's see if I can duplicate how I do it in a guitar. Something like that. I usually can construct these right in the control plate, so that's another little thing, but I think that'll work. But see how I've got this kind of sprung away to where it's actually all the way bound against there. Now this has to do a lot with heat too. So here we go. So we got to heat up the pot to temperature, but we also have to heat the leg of the cap up to temperature. Now here's the trick. It takes a lot more heat to heat up the pot than it does to heat up the leg of the cap. That's why I use a lot of heat. I was able to quickly do that. That's a good solder joint. I did not overheat the cap. Now sometimes certain styles of caps will make it very dangerous to do this without damaging the cap. So what you can do is take an alligator clip and put it right here, and that will soak off the heat so that it doesn't go into the cap and damage the cap. But we were able to do that so quickly that it was not an issue. So let's go ahead and trim this. This is not the cleanest way to do it because this is not my normal cutters that I use, but so there we go. So now we have, and actually, let's see, I wouldn't do it this way. There, that'll work. So now we have, I just didn't want this leg to touch the cap. But anyways, so now we have two solid joints. Obviously we would trim this up cleaner and make this look a lot cleaner if we were actually putting it into a guitar. But now let's look at the other thing. This is another issue that we have with a cap. So if we're going to make a tone pot or a volume pot, and this leg has to be bent back and soldered to the guitar or soldered to the case, it's tough because sometimes there's a gap. Ooh, let's not use that. Burn your fingers. I've done that many times. Picked up a leg of a capacitor and then went ahead and burned my finger. So here's the thing. You can't really bridge a gap with solder. Everybody thinks you can, but you can't. Not effectively anyway. So you have to actually heat that. You actually have to bend this back far enough to where it is touching here, because trying to bridge that gap is almost impossible. So my tips for soldering are a couple of things. One, use plenty of heat. Don't be afraid of it. Practice on some old components so you know you're not going to burn anything up. Two, make sure that when you solder a wire into a lug that you heat both items up at the equivalent temperature for the equivalent amount of time so that they bond together properly. If you try to heat one up and then heat the other one up, it's tougher to get a good solder, okay? The other thing is, make sure that you protect your component from overheating if you are going to do a joint like this, especially if you don't have a good soldering iron where you're really trying to it takes a long time to put heat into that item. It takes a lot longer. It's a lot easier to damage it if you don't have enough heat, because heat will go into there as you sit there and wait and wait and wait and wait for it to get hot enough. So there's a couple of tips on actual guitar components. If you have any questions, let me know. If you want to know any specific questions about how to solder stuff, let me know. Again, my name is Dylan. This has been Dylan Talks Tone, and some soldering tips for you.